Hey everybody, welcome. This is Ali Amagasu and you're listening to the latest episode of Cloud Unfiltered. We're having a really special episode today. I'm not going to jump into why yet, but I will say good morning to my co-host, Pete Johnson. Hey Pete.
Hey Ali, how you doing? Yeah, I'm excited for this one. Anybody who's played the Cloud Unfiltered podcast drinking game knows the passion that I have for serverless. And I've had a project that I've been working on the last 9 months or so in the serverless on Kubernetes space, which sounds like an oxymoron, but I promise you it is not. And our guest today has been my chief partner in crime on the open source project, where we've spent a lot of time on this design pattern. But by day, he's a rock star SE in the Cisco world, and I'll let you ask him some questions about that before we get into the project we've been working on, which is called FONK, F-O-N-K.
Can you tell me what?
Yeah, well, okay. So it's that the F is function as a service, the O is object storage, the N is NoSQL, and the K is Kubernetes. And it's a design pattern that you can use to build serverless web applications. And well, I'll let you introduce our guest, and we'll learn a little bit about him before we get into the details of sort of where that idea came from and what we've been doing with it, and the different speaking engagements that we've had that you can learn more about it.
Awesome. Thank you, Pete. Yeah, so the mystery guest today is kind of Pete's partner in FONK, or certainly one of his close collaborators, I think, on this project. His name is Julio Gomez, and he is coming to us from Madrid, Spain, I believe, right? Good morning. Well, good evening, Julio.
Absolutely. Good morning for you guys. Thanks a lot for inviting me. Thanks a lot for having me in the show. It's a real pleasure. I've been, just watching your episodes for a long time, and now suddenly I'm here. So it's quite like an impression for me. So thanks a lot for that.
So just to let the audience know who you are, Julio also works for Cisco. He's the lead for programmability in our EMEA region. And well, what's interesting is that hasn't always been what you've done, right? You were more of a kind of dyed-in-the-wool Cisco CCIE kind of guy, right?
Absolutely. I've been a Cisco veteran for the last 18 years. I joined in the year 2000, so I've been here for a long time. I've been going through, the usual path that our Cisco SEs go through. So been going into networking, did all the things about voice over IP, did security, did basically all the different architectures, then went into service provider, but got my CCIE. So basically I've been, just enjoying the usual classic networking stuff that we've been doing in Cisco, and the thing that we are famous for. But then a couple of years ago, something happened to me, and basically I watched someone deliver a session that really impressed me. His name is Hank Preston, one of the DevNet people. Yeah, and I was so impressed that just after the session, I decided that I needed to go into that. I needed to understand what he was talking about. I needed to replicate what he was doing, because I saw that there was an immediate value for our customers and partners. So that's where everything started. And 2 years later, what was my night job, which was things that I was doing by night, things that I enjoyed, like programming and using APIs and going into Kubernetes and Docker, suddenly, became my day job. And it was kind of a dream come true.
That's pretty impressive. So Hank is from DevNet, right? So what was he presenting about?
He was presenting about microservices-based application and how it was scheduled via a product that we were working with at that time with Mesos. And it was so impressive, the way that he was communicating, the way that he was presenting, but also the immediate value of what he was showing, and how the line of business owners from our customers were using that language, and those were the challenges that they were facing. And we were still talking to the IT people, and it was like, wow, we are not talking to these guys because we don't understand what they are talking about. We don't understand the language of the challenges. And suddenly I'm starting to realize that I could learn that using these tools. So that's where everything started for me.
Well, kudos to you, Julio. I mean, if you'd already been doing Cisco stuff and you were a network expert, most people would be comfortable to sit in that and be like, yeah, I'm a network expert. I don't really need to know anything else. And for you to say, I'm going to go explore this new approach to our business and to our customers' needs, that's pretty awesome. So
yeah, and at the end of the day, what I'm trying to do in my new role is to do exactly that. What Hank did in that session to me, excite the audience up to the point where they need to learn what you are showing them.
You just gave me the perfect segue. So what are we exciting audiences about today, Pete? I'm going to let you go ahead and finish introducing FONK and talking about, why all the items in that acronym are important, and what you mean by, design patterns.
So if you've touched at all in the application development world in the last 20 years, you probably know the LAMP stack, LAMP, right? Linux, Apache, MySQL, and either PHP or Python is typically what the P means. And I mean, there's lots of choices that app developers have when constructing application architectures. So how do you limit those choices to a couple of different combinations that make sense? And that's really what LAMP is. Now, Julio just talked about microservices-based applications. Among the first applications you typically deploy when you're learning that is the Kubernetes Guestbook. It's a very simple application that has a simple form, and it's meant to mimic a guest book that you might see at a wedding. So Ali walks up to the guest book and signs her name. Julio walks up to the guest book. He sees that Ali has signed and he signs his name. And I walk up the third person and I see what the first two people have written. I can do that as well. So it's a virtual version of that, where if Ali, you load up your browser and you point it to the guestbook application and you write something and push the submit button. If I then go to that same URL, I would see what you wrote already and I would get to write something, and so on and so forth. So it's very simple.
Are most developers familiar with this, like kind of the use of this guestbook?
They are. It's kind of the hello world of the Kubernetes or microservices world. It's typically the first application you deploy while you're trying to learn what microservices are.
Got it.
So it's broken up into 3 different containers. One is responsible for serving up the HTML for the web UI that you see, and it sits behind a load balancer. And typically you deploy 3 instances of that so that you can handle load. There's another container that handles writes to the database, and then there's another set of containers. You typically deploy 2 of them to handle the reads from the database. So each group of containers sits behind a load balancer so that you could update them with rolling updates without interrupting the service. And you can individually scale. If you had a bunch of people doing writes, maybe you add a second or a third write container while that's going on, and then scale it down later. So you can scale those 3 components independent of one another. So it's the typical, day one, what's a microservice? Here's a very simple application that you deploy, and it's all, the individual containers are still based on that LAMP stack that most of the internet in the late 90s and early 2000s was built on. So that's what we mean by design pattern. And really what we're doing with FONK is building on top of that design pattern. I guess, Julio, before I introduce a little more specifics about FONK, you've got your own application that you've built for a hobby, and you went down a microservices road, and then you kind of went to a serverless road, right? So why don't you talk about what that experience is like and what limitations you ran into?
Absolutely. I'm a big fan of vintage guitars. I've been a guitar player for my whole life. I've been playing bands for my whole life. And then at some point, I decided, I had an epiphany. I went into Google, I searched for something, and it did not appear. Can you imagine that?
I know that.
For something in Google. It's amazing. It's an amazing feeling. And at that point, I decided to create that. And I decided to do it in a website. So I created my website on vintage guitars from the 50s and so on. And, when Lambda showed up, I'm an Amazon architect as well. So I was really fluent on all the different services. And I was really excited about Lambda when it showed up. So I decided to implement my website there and see how it went. And I loved it. It was fantastic. And I really loved the way that you could work with your code and everything. The problem was that when I wanted to, move my code somewhere else, it was very, very difficult because I had such a lock-in into their own setup, their way of doing things, that I was not that happy. I really had to stay with them. So at some point, I decided I need to move away from there. And that's where I thought that the idea of having an approach where you could have your microservices-based application independent of the underlying infrastructure would be really cool. And serverless was bringing you the ability to just put your code out there and do it. Then at that point, I went to San Jose for a meeting, and I meet Pete. And it was like
it was fortuitous that we got seated next to each other, right?
Exactly, and it was really strange because I was reading about this guy everywhere. I was like, I know the guy from Clicker. I know him. The name is familiar. It's like when you see an actor. It's like I know the name. I know the guy. But then suddenly I was with him there, and Pete was kind enough as to share his ideas on how to, maybe implement serverless on top of Kubernetes. And I came from a strong background on Kubernetes, and I was like, man, I would love to contribute to what you are trying to do. And the rest is history.
So before you guys dive any deeper, for any members of our audience who don't know what Lambda is, I know you mentioned it while you were explaining what you were using the first time to launch your site. What's Lambda?
Yeah, Lambda is the first commercial approach that I know of onto serverless. So the people from Amazon decided that they wanted to offer the option to just provide your code and not having to manage any of the underlying infrastructure, and then bill you, so you only have to pay for the number of calls into your code. So that's kind of the ultimate nirvana state for any kind of applications that you want to launch as a business. I'm only paying for the number of customers or the number of calls that my customer do to my code. So that's absolutely great. If I have great success, yeah, I will pay for those calls. But if I don't have any success at all, I will not pay a single dollar. So that's really, really attractive for a lot of businesses. And even for my own website, it was really attractive. And Lambda was implementation that Amazon did for that first commercial product. After that, we have had other offerings from people like, from companies like Google or Microsoft or many others. But the first one that I know of was Lambda. Very familiar.
So you were enjoying Lambda, your site's up, but then you kind of hit the wall as far as that nirvana you described. You run into Pete, you meet Pete. Pete, what happens next?
Well, at about the same time, I had been advocating Lambda and serverless both kind of with night job stuff and inside of Cisco. You can imagine sitting up in front of a bunch of data center sales engineers and telling them how awesome serverless is. I've had that experience. And what I realized is that there was kind of a conceptual learning curve that people were struggling with. I saw a tweet at about the time that I can't find now that said that serverless is a solution looking for a problem. And while that's not true, the fact that someone thinks it's true means that the serverless community isn't doing a good enough job sort of giving people a hand to get in the boat with them. So I started to think, okay, what do people know? Well, people generally understand LAMP stacks and they understand Kubernetes Guestbook. So what if I just rebuilt the Kubernetes Guestbook using Lambda? What would that look like? Well, what that looks like is instead of having a container that does all your HTML generation and then connects back to your read and write containers, what that looks like instead is you have static HTML and JavaScript that would sit on object storage. So in Amazon speak, that's S3, which you can turn into a static website fairly easily. The user points their browser to that static HTML and loads the JavaScript, and the JavaScript then makes a set of REST API calls to API gateway to do, like an HTTP GET or an HTTP POST. And what you can do in Lambda is with each of those verbs, you can have a different Lambda function execute when one of those verbs is requested. So if I'm doing the read, so if Ali, if you've already written something to the database, and then I come in and I load the static HTML, the JavaScript will run and go call the API gateway with the get verb. The get verb will launch a Lambda instance of my function. That function will then talk to the backend DynamoDB in Amazon speak. And then it will take all that data that's already been written, in this case, your message on the guest book, and it would put it back, and my browser would format it in a nice way. And the writes work in a similar way. So it's instead of having a container for the front end and two containers for doing reads and writes, it's object storage to handle the static HTML content. It's an API gateway and individual functions for the verbs of that gateway, and then it's some kind of NoSQL store in the background with DynamoDB. And when I did that, it was a nice learning experience. But then I started to think about, well, this isn't very portable. The exact same thing that Julio ran into. So I thought, okay, is there a way to do this in a more open source way? And that's when I started to research. There's an emerging set of function as a service runtimes that run on top of Kubernetes. And that changed in the 6 months that Julio and I did this research and came up with this. So what we came up with was this idea of, okay, well, what if we rewrote the Kubernetes Guestbook as a serverless application on top of every one of the most popular function as a service for Kubernetes runtimes? What would that look like, and what would we learn? So we learned a lot about how each of the individual function as a service runtimes operates on top of Kubernetes, and how some of them are a little bit more like native Docker, and some of them are a little more like Lambda. And so we would kind of have a litmus test that would help us compare the different frameworks against one another, so you could sort of see, well, what kind of experience do you want? If you want a more Docker-like experience, then you might choose framework A. If you wanted a more Lambda-like experience, you might choose framework B, without kind of making judgments as to which one of those experiences is better, but just kind of writing the code to learn what the intricacies of each individual one is, and how each one works. And that's really what FONK is. So it was originally intended to be like a lower the learning curve for serverless, and it still does that, but then it also kind of turned into well, hey, if I'm writing the same application across all these, then we can start to make some statements that compare the different function as a service on Kubernetes. So does that make sense?
It does. So you set out to test the most popular function as a service runtimes, or to write this code to that.
That all run on top of Kubernetes, yes.
So how did you identify which were the most popular, and were you successful in doing that?
So the litmus test we came up with was 3,000 stars on GitHub. They're all open source projects. And that was there's probably a dozen of them out there, but not all of them are as popular on GitHub. So that's what we used as the litmus test, is which ones have 3,000 stars or more. And then we made one exception, and it's going to be clear why we made that exception. And it changed while we were doing it. We had to add one while we were doing it. And then there were 3 or 4 of us who were interested in this, and each one of us grabbed a combination, because each one of these function as a service runtimes supports up to 5 different languages. So we kind of started with, okay, let's do it on Node, and let's do it maybe on Python. And we kind of divvied up the work, and we've got a bunch of functioning guestbook, serverless-based guestbook that then you can use as kind of a learning opportunity to learn these different function as a service runtimes. So I've been kind of coy about which ones they are.
Yes, you have. I was trying to get you to spill that.
Okay, so I'm going to give these to you in the order that they're most like Lambda, into the order that they're most like native Kubernetes. Okay, so the one that's most like Lambda is Apache OpenWhisk, and that one is sponsored by IBM. And there's kind of four key things that we measure here. Like, are you exposed to the Docker file? Are you exposed to the fact that there is or is not an image repository behind the scenes? Do you have to have a local Docker to compile images against? And does the framework provide a base image? OpenWhisk obscures all of those things from you. So you have no idea any of that stuff is under the hood, even though it is running on top of native Kubernetes.
That is very fancy, and that you're saying that's most like Lambda.
It is. It's the most like Lambda, and that shouldn't be a surprise, because it's what IBM runs its function as a service on its public cloud. It's what they use for that. So that it's kind of not a mistake that ends up being the most like Lambda. So the next one is called Kubeless, and it's sponsored by it just left my head. It's sponsored by Bitnami, which is kind of a late stage startup. They still hide the Docker file. The Docker file's there, but they hide it from you. But you don't have to interact with any of the image repositories, local Docker, or the base images. The next one is called Fission, and that's also by a late stage startup called Platform 9. They completely hide the Docker file, the image repo, and the local Docker, but they do have a base image that you have to pop into your Kubernetes cluster in order for that to all work. Then we start getting into some of the big boys. So there's a project that went live while we were doing, in the 6 months that we were doing this experiment, called FN, the FN project. And it's sponsored by Oracle. And they do hide the Docker file from you, but in creating your functions, you're very much exposed to the fact that there is an image repository. You do have to have a local Docker to compile your images, and they do have a base image involved. At least when I worked with it last time in the fall, I'm desperate to get back to try all these again 6 months later to see how they've advanced. But when we did this research concluding in the fall, that's what the status of this was.
And can I interrupt you for 1 sec? So being exposed to those details, that's not necessarily desirable, right? Am I correct in understanding that?
It depends. It depends. I think Julio and I have had the experience that we prefer the more Lambda-like experience. But if you're somebody that's coming, if you've done a lot of native Kubernetes development, you feel like you might be losing some functionality and you still want access to it. So it really depends on your perspective and where you're coming from. Do you agree with that, Julio?
Yeah, and in fact, it's funny because Pete was mentioning that this came up during the process, during those 6 months, that FN finally came up as a player. And it came from the fact that I was in a Docker meetup here locally in Madrid, and then suddenly there was people from Oracle, just talking at the Docker event, and we're like, what are they going to be talking about? And it's like, no, we are guys from Oracle, but we are doing just FN. And we were like overwhelmed, like, wow, this is great. And as Pete was saying, it's great because you have visibility about what's happening, under, the implementation that they do. And that for Docker people, for Kubernetes people, it's great. So, each one has its own preference.
Okay.
Now, the next one on the list has the biggest following, and it's called OpenFaaS, OpenFaaS. And we actually have a contributor on the DevNet team, Jock, who's a contributor to OpenFaaS. And there's actually, if you go to the DevNet sandboxes, there's already OpenFaaS. There's a pre-installed OpenFaaS environment if you wanted to play with that one. That one, the founder is a guy named Alex Ellis, who's just a freaking genius. And he was drawing a salary until recently from the open source group at VMware, but I just saw on Twitter in the last week or so that he's moving on. So VMware had some influence over that, but it's not clear how much influence that one has so far. And that one's kind of the oldest of these, I would say, as well. And then you contrast that with the newest of them, which is the one we kind of made the exception for, although we actually we haven't yet built a FONK example for it, and that's Knative from Google. So they announced that at Google Next last summer, and it's by far, as you would imagine, the most Kubernetes-like in its existence. And it's not, the weird thing about Knative is it's not clear whether, does Knative want to be a competitor of these other five, or does it want to be the base framework that the other five use? And again, my research here on this is probably 6 months old, because the cycle that we did on this is, so we did all this research last summer into last fall, and then we've kind of been in, okay, now that we learned all this stuff, let's turn around and let's do some talks about this. And so I've got one coming up at DevNet Create here in April, but Julio, you've already done a talk on this and you're about to do another one. What's your experience been with reaction of people when they hear these concepts?
Yeah, the first one the first time that we introduced FONK was during CodeMotion. CodeMotion is the biggest developer event here in Europe, and they do Italy, they do Milan in Italy, they do in Amsterdam, they do the Netherlands, they also do Madrid here in Spain. And for the one in Madrid, I proposed a talk and it was accepted. I gotta tell you, if you take a look at the photos and the video recording, we had this huge auditorium and it was completely full with people that really thought that it was interesting. The funny note there is that at the same time that I was delivering my talk on the room next to me, it was there was a session with the creator of this game called Doom, and the creator was playing Doom next to me, and people still wanted to come see me, and I was like, I would have gone the other place, right? But yeah, it was good, and the feedback that we got, and you can see the reaction during the recording, is that people were really, really excited about it, really interested in what we were trying to do there. There were some questions that I had not even thought about. Like, for example, there was a guy asking, hey, why would I do this on Kubernetes? I would have to buy a Kubernetes cluster for this. And it's like, well, that is not the point. You're not going to buy a Kubernetes cluster, the hardware and everything, and then only to run serverless. That we take for granted that you have a Kubernetes cluster and you are using it for many other things. So the beauty of this is that you will be able to implement, serverless on top of the already existing Kubernetes implementation. But yeah, there were a ton of questions. People were really interested. People tend to like the fact that this is not related to a company. So it's just a Cisco employee delivering this message, but it's not explicitly preaching, a Cisco product, but rather how you can implement this on top of whatever Kubernetes implementation. The linkage that I do into Cisco is that we use our own sandbox. We use our own environment, to test it out. And we also offer the capability to our customers or interested parties to use that same kind of setup. And that is very valuable for them because probably they don't have a Kubernetes cluster to play with, or maybe they could just mess it up. So here we are offering also the option to implement it there and play around with it.
I didn't know we had a sandbox set up. Is that so publicly people could access that right now?
Yeah. So if you just go to devnet, developer.cisco.com and go and find the devnet sandbox so I do all my development for this on top of CCP, the Cisco Container Platform. And we've got instructions on the repo. So if you wanted to try this out, if you go to fonk-apps.io, that's kind of the marketing webpage. And then there's a link there to the GitHub repo where it's got all the code and the walkthrough examples and so forth on that. And yeah, I mean, when we show this, you could do it on top of any Kubernetes cluster, as Julio just said, but we tend to do the work on top of Cisco Container Platform cluster because I mean the cool thing about that is with DevNet you can get at least 6 hours of a DevNet of a CCP cluster for free. And depending,
nice.
And you can extend that as well. So it doesn't cost you anything to try it, and it gives you some exposure to what Cisco is doing in containers, and then also exposes you to this larger effort going on with serverless on top of Kubernetes. Now, one thing, Julio, I can't remember whether you were on the video link when I presented this internally back in November, but one of the things I like to talk about with why would I do this on top of Kubernetes? If you think about So Guestbook, you've got three services, or load balancers is the other way to think about that, and you've got nine pods or containers. That's the footprint of that application. Well, if I had 10 of those, now that's 30 services and 90 pods that I have to manage in some way, or that somebody has to manage in some way. Well, if you're using, let's just say OpenWhisk to operate OpenWhisk is somewhere on the order of 10 containers and 5 or 6 services or load balancers for different things. And that number isn't going to increase regardless of how many applications you have on top of it. So from an IT ops perspective, you might want to do this because it's going to reduce the burden that you have of managing Kubernetes, because you're ultimately going to have fewer containers and services to manage in aggregate across all your different applications. For an individual application, yeah, it's a give and take. You could make an argument about developer productivity and not having to learn Docker files and those sorts of things. But from an IT ops perspective, on an individual application basis, yeah, maybe this isn't a good idea. But if you look across the aggregate, if I'm managing 10 microservices applications or 100 microservices applications, how can I make it so that I can lower the number, lower that number of containers I'm having to manage? And this is one way to do that.
Nice, yeah. So I went and I looked at the video on the website, and what I walked away from is, as why this would be interesting is, first off, you're sharing resources. There's less wasted time, right? Yeah. You're talking about how 100 milliseconds, most of it isn't being used. Less code and config, smaller attack surface. I think that's interesting, and fewer containers to manage.
Yeah,
you got it. Correct?
The video worked. Woohoo!
The video worked. You helped the marketing gal understand what the heck value.
And now you got that song stuck in your head all day, right?
Yes, that is the best part.
Very intentionally. I won't divulge what it is, and you have to go listen to it yourself. But I was inspired by, as weird as this sounds, So that song is featured in the Guardians of the Galaxy ride at Disney's California Adventure is where that came from.
And if you know Pete, you know he loves Disney. He's been on that ride. Guaranteed. I haven't. I live in Southern California. Pete lives in Michigan. My kids, I have never taken them to Disneyland. As far as they're concerned, it's an they don't even really believe that it exists.
They can take your kids away from you in California for that, can't they?
I mean, literally, we live 2 hours from it. We can get in the car and be there before lunchtime today, and we do not go. So it's so funny.
Well, and I guess to be clear, this is a learning and it's a science experiment at this point, right? It's in 5 years, we're not going to have 6 Kubernetes, function as a service on top of Kubernetes. Like we're going to see some contraction in this, but we don't know who the winners are going to be at this point. I mean, typically, it's not always people with the most funding that win, but that's often the case. But in this case, we wanted a way to sort of measure the experience in a consistent way across all these things, and kind of have a way to talk about it in a constructive way without judgment and see where it goes. And like I said, we went through this first cycle of let's experiment, now let's talk about it. And I think here, because Julio and I are going to work together on something else together in our day jobs here pretty soon. I think we'll probably, when we get to the summer, hit another refresh on the research part of this and have some new things to talk about for fall. But so Julio, you've got another talk coming up, right? I've got DevNet Create in April, and you've got another one coming up here even sooner than that, right?
Yeah, it's next week. Next week I will be in Pixels Camp, which is another international event for developers. So I will be delivering my talk on this specific topic. I would like to introduce also some concepts of what I did with Val for Cisco Live. We did that 4 hours tutorial. That was cool. Which is really, really cool. We were working like hell on creating something meaningful. For our testing and for the community that Pete is driving, it's great to have this foundational application like Guestbook or basic applications that show and demonstrate how you can get started. But we also wanted to go to the other side, and we wanted to show what you can really build, using functions. So we decided to create a real application based on how you can do object recognition on images. So basically, you can upload a photo of your family, and it will tell you how many people is in the photo, how many dogs, or how many bicycles. So instead of doing that, the usual way, which would be, you go into a service offered by Google or whoever, and then they do the hard work for you. We decided to do everything on premises with serverless and Kubernetes, train the model ourselves with TensorFlow, and make it happen locally. So by the end of the tutorial, people attending the tutorial were leaving with a real application built that they could take home. So I'm going to try and extract some of the content that we did there. Obviously, it was a 4 hours tutorial, and I'm going into a 50-minute session using Pixels Camp. But I think it's really cool to demonstrate what can be done so that people can have a real vision of what can be accomplished with what they are starting right now.
So just to be clear, you guys, this isn't something Cisco's selling in any way. This is just...
No, I mean, one of the cool things culturally about Cisco is, I mean, it's not written down like it is at Google where you get 20% time, right? But you are encouraged to experiment and go try to find new things. And that's what Julio and I are doing here.
Nice.
Right? I mean...
So it's your professional side hustle.
That's exactly what it is. That's a good way to put it. And it's the kind of thing where we can justify it to our managers because this, after microservices, serverless is kind of the next natural extension to the way application architecture is going to be done. And it's not that all application architectures will be done with serverless, just like, people are still running COBOL and bare metal and, in banks all over the world. And, the world doesn't end every day because we have that, but there's constantly evolving new things, and you need people in a company of this size that have the flexibility to go learn and experiment and fail and succeed and do those kind of things. And Julio and I are fortunate enough that we've got a management that supports that kind of stuff for us. And so think of it as our side hustle is absolutely the right way to think of it. But in this case, it's a side hustle that has some relevance to the Cisco Container Platform product, and by extension, the UCS product and the HyperFlex products on top of which CCP runs. So that's kind of how we can justify spending time with it. Is it's, it ultimately can benefit CCP, HyperFlex, and UCS. And
but even if it doesn't, it's just benefiting anybody who's trying to create serverless environments and use them.
Right.
Yeah.
Nice.
And it really helps when the person that you work with, it's a big guy like Pete. It's not the same saying I'm working with this guy that I'm working with this principal. He's a big guy. He knows his stuff.
Do you mean physically large or really important?
So I think he probably
both of them.
So, come on. So, dude, you've been working here for 18 years. You look like you're barely 18 years old, for starters, right? You always make me feel old whenever I'm in a room with you. And if you go try to watch that code motion, spoiler alert, it's all in Spanish because my man Julio speaks 2 languages better than I speak 1. So.
And for those of you who are listening to this and not viewing, although I don't think you can tell when you're watching either, Pete is both a big deal and a big human being.
I'm 6'6". I go 265 right now. So
there we go. That's a big human being.
Definitely.
You guys, we're running out of time here. Anything else that the audience should know about FONK before we wrap it up?
No, I think just that we're still it's an experiment. It's a way to have a conversation about where microservices and serverless are going, and it's fonk-apps.io if you want to get started with it or start to play with it. And we've got stuff going on at DevNet Create, at this talk that Julio has next week. We still have to get our heads together for what we're doing for Cisco Live, but I at least have my Serverless 101 talk is going to be in the DevNet Zone at Cisco Live here in June as well. So lots of opportunities to see it live and to learn about it.
Nice. My non-FONK related Cisco closing question is for you, Julio. Everybody should know that in addition to having a professional side hustle working on FONK, Julio has a non-professional side hustle, which is apparently some very, very large vintage guitar community. Am I describing that correctly, Julio? Tell me what that's all about.
Absolutely, yeah. It's kind of my project. I started it in 2003 after the epiphany of not finding something in Google. So I decided to create it myself. And as of today, the website has 6 million visits. It's very, very big. It's referenced all across the world. I'm invited to vintage guitar shows. Every year I go to Dallas for the Arlington Vintage Guitar Show. And yeah, I really love it. And it's my way to give back to the community. It's very much in line with this open source mentality that we all have in this world. So it's the same approach, but for other area, in my case, vintage guitars.
So
but really proud of it.
What's the name of the site and how many members are there?
It's not about membership, but more about visits, because I don't close it to anyone. Everyone can visit and have access to all the information. And the name of the site is burstserial.com, like in sunbursts, burstserial.com. And it's really a freaky thing. It focuses only on information about a specific model of guitar that was built in 3 years, 58, 59, and 60. Wow.
So that's what you searched on Google and you got no results for?
Exactly. Nothing existed on that, so I decided to go for it.
Does your page come up pretty high in the Google results now?
If you operate, you will find it. It's very, very easy. I'm basically everywhere. It's surprising. I didn't think that anybody would be interested in checking it out, but yeah.
That's pretty wild. That's pretty wild. Well, cool. So you got a side hustle on your side hustle. So
exactly.
Julio, thank you for joining us today. I know you gotta get out of here. You're in a different time zone. Thank you, Pete. I've been dying to talk with you about this project. I know it's your passion, and so I'm glad you guys came on to help share it with the listeners. Because gosh, if this isn't relevant to this audience, I don't know what is. So thanks so much. Have a great day, you guys, and we'll talk again soon.
Bye now.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Bye-bye.
Talk to you very soon. Ciao, ciao.